to the wind, as one with wind and cloud.
Spring forth by royal decree. Don't blink, nowhere to hide. Good. Yeah.
Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to a complete and updated Keqing guide. In today's video, what we're going to do is cover everything you need to know about Keqing and why she got so much better with the release of the new Dendro reactions. In fact, I'm going to break down her talents and abilities and talk about the new way to play and build Keqing, which is in an Aggravate team, which is a new Dendro Electro reaction that actually makes this character very powerful, as you guys will see throughout this video. So as I said, I'm going to show you guys why Keqing is actually really good now, and then talk about how to build her efficiently, covering her best artifacts, weapons, teams, and much more. And also, as always, I do want you to know that I do stream most nights on Twitch, and as always, there will be the link in the description if you're interested. With that said, I want to keep this intro short, so let's get right into it. Alright, so starting things off, let's talk about Keqing's talents and abilities, give you a brief rundown on her kit and what it does, and then move on to some more advanced information like why Aggravate is so good, as well as her optimal combos and how to play her efficiently. First of all, her elemental skill is going to be the core part of her kit. Her elemental skill is an ability that has basically two parts. First of all, you throw this lightning stiletto. It will deal a bit of electro damage, but then will explode upon either reactivating it or doing a charge attack. Now, typically, if you want to play Electro Keqing, which is what this guide is going to be focusing on, you're going to repress your elemental skill right after, because once you do that, all of your attacks will be infused with Electro for the next 5 seconds. This is because of one of Keqing's passive talents that will infuse your weapon with Electro, as I said, once you do double tap your skill. Because of that, that is typically how you're going to be using it. However, if you want to play physical Keqing or another element and don't want to infuse yourself with Electro, what you can do is press E and then do a charge attack, because then the stiletto will explode, deal a decent amount of Electro damage, and then your Keqing will stay physical and won't be infused with Electro. With that said though, since Aggravate is such a powerful reaction, you are typically going to be wanting to play Electro Keqing, which is why you want to typically be using your skill and repressing it to infuse your attacks with Electro. Now, something to keep in mind, and a more advanced tip with this ability, is that your elemental skill actually lasts quite a while. What this means is you can use it and then do something else and then reactivate it and then get the 5-second Electro infusion from the moment you recast your elemental skill. So the 5-second timer only starts after the second part of your skill, which means you can do something like this where you use your skill, then use your elemental burst, and then reuse your skill after, and then have that Electro infusion for as long as possible. On top of that, if you're running the 4-piece Thundering Fury set, since your elemental skills cooldown will be reduced, you can effectively spam this ability and get some really cool rotations, which we'll talk about a bit later. Moving on, for your elemental burst, this is a pretty straightforward ability, but a very good one, at least for Keqing's kit, as you just do a bunch of Electro damage in an AoE. This ability hits multiple times, as you can see, 1 instance of skill damage, then 8 slashes, and then a final attack that will deal a much higher scaling than the previous hits, on only a 12-second cooldown with a very low energy cost of 40. Because of that, it is going to be a very good ability to spam, especially in an Electro build with the Aggravate reaction, where it's actually going to be doing a lot of damage. Another thing to note about this ability is that thanks to one of your passive talents, you will actually gain 15% crit rate and energy recharge after using this ability for 8 seconds. This is actually a really good passive because 15 crit rate is honestly pretty huge, and it lasts for 8 seconds while your burst only has a 12-second cooldown, so it does have a pretty good uptime. Because of that, you want to be careful not to overcap on crit rate. You want to make sure you factor in this 15% crit rate when looking at your crit rate to crit damage ratio, assuming you are spamming your burst and can maintain this uptime. Now, for a bit more advanced information, first of all, I want to start by talking about Keqing's very powerful charge attacks. As you may already know by now, Keqing's charge attacks are a core part of her kit and one of your main sources of damage as a main DPS. While especially with Aggravate Keqing, spamming your skill and your burst as often as possible is essential, you also want to be weaving in charge attacks for however long you are on Keqing on field. Now, while that can vary from team to team, and there are different playstyles like quick swapping, where you're changing between a lot of characters and not spending too much time on Keqing, and a more DPS role where you spend more time on her, charge attacking is going to be very efficient when you are on Keqing. Because of that, for your highest DPS, what you want to do is obviously going to be spamming as many charge attacks as possible, so doing one normal attack into a charge attack. With that said, you lose a lot of stamina that way, and it can also be annoying in the sense that it can knock enemies away from you. Because of that, if you're running low on stamina or want to do an efficient combo to preserve stamina and weave in as many charge attacks as possible, you can do 4 normal attacks into a charge attack, which is going to be your generalistic combo. Also, regarding your elemental skill usage, in an Aggravate team comp, especially when you're running the 4-piece Thundering Fury, as I mentioned a bit earlier, you do want to make sure you're using your skill as often as possible. As I said, the cooldown will reset when you do proc Electro reactions like Aggravate. Because of that, what you want to do is still use your skill and then use your burst, and then after that, repress your skill, infusing your attacks with Electro, then doing your normal combos and weaving in charge attacks as you can. And as you can see through the footage on screen right now, your elemental skill cooldown is going to be decreasing as you proc those reactions, so you do want to make sure to spam your skill as often as as possible to really get the most value out of it and the maximum DPS from this team comp. Other than that though, this team is pretty straightforward to play. Just make sure you're applying Dendro, applying Electro, and also if you run an Anemo support, which you typically will be, make sure you're swirling Electro to really buff your Electro damage through supportive artifact sets like Viridescent Venerer and the Anemo characters' passives like Sucrose passive, which gives you EM, and Kazu's passive, which increases your elemental damage. I do want to say, however, that an Aggravate Keqing team specifically is a bit more quick swappy than a other playstyle in the sense that yes, you're going to be doing charge attacks on Keqing, and yes, she's going to be your main DPS, you're going to spend the most time on her, but you are going to be swapping out of her quite often to use your support character's abilities after doing a few charge attacks and using your skill as many times as you can thanks to the Thundering Fury set. So be sure to keep that in mind when playing Keqing. Don't be afraid to swap out of her, especially to refresh your support abilities cooldowns like resummoning Oz, using your Anemo support, and obviously your Dendro support character's burst to constantly apply Dendro. And lastly, I did want to add that you should level all of your talents for an Electro Keqing, especially in a Dendro team, because you're going to be spamming your skill as often as possible, spamming your burst as well, which both deal a good amount of Electro damage. And then for your normal and charge attacks, those are going to be important the more time you spend on Keqing, which does vary based on your team, so keep that in mind. But in general, leveling your very powerful charge attacks is also going to be quite important. Now, before moving on, I do want to talk about one of the most important sections of this video, which is regarding why Aggravate Keqing is so good now and why I'm making this video. Well, as you guys know, with the release of Sumeru, we got the Dendro element, which gave us new reactions. When you pair Dendro with Electro, you can proc Quicken and then proc Aggravate by using more Electro on the Quicken aura that is applied to enemies. And because of the way Quicken works, applying a ton of Electro to it and proccing Aggravate as much as possible is going to be insane for your team's damage and for your Electro damage specifically. Because of that, having a Dendro support like the main character or others on your team supporting your Electro carries is going to be crucial for maximizing your Electro team DPS. Previously, Keqing was someone who didn't really have two powerful reactions. Yes, she could proc Electro Charge, but that was pretty much it. Now with Aggravate, you actually not only have a use for your very fast Electro application, but will also just deal a lot more damage than you were dealing before because of the way this reaction works. In fact, since Aggravate is a reaction that does additive damage, it will be affected with the stats that you're building on your Keqing. It scales on your Elemental Mastery, your damage bonus, and your crit, for example, which means that it's going to be doing a ton of damage. On top of that, since you want to be applying as much Electro as possible, running a team like this with Keqing, who has a lot of Electro application, and Fischl, who does that as well, paired with a flex option at the end, who is typically going to be a damage buffer, for example, an Anemo character like Kazu or Sucrose, who will give you even more damage thanks to their passives and the Viridescent Venerer set. Because of that, an Aggravate Keqing team is going to be absolutely amazing to deal just a ton of Electro damage consistently throughout your entire rotation. Another strength of Keqing is that since she does apply Electro pretty fast, you are going to be proccing Aggravate a lot, which will also give you more damage through Fischl's Ascension passive, which is something that triggers every time you proc an Electro reaction and is the main reason why Fischl is so broken in this patch, as I've mentioned in previous videos. And so because of that and every other strength that I mentioned thus far, Keqing is actually a good DPS now that I do recommend using, especially when you keep in mind the fact that she is a standard character that most people will be getting just by pulling and losing 50/50s. Now moving on, for the artifact sets you want on Keqing, in general, she's a character who has a ton of options. With the new Dendro team though, the new Aggravate Keqing build, I would highly recommend trying to get the 4-piece of the Thundering Fury set, as it is just the go-to and the best one for this team comp. The reason for this is because Thundering Fury will not only give you 15% damage bonus on the 2-piece, but the 4-piece will also buff your Aggravate's damage bonus by 20%, while also decreasing your elemental skill cooldown by 1 second every time you proc an Electro reaction such as Quicken. This can happen once every 0.8 seconds and is crucial to maximizing your Keqing's damage because you just get to spam your skill very, very often. As you can see from a clip I'll play right now, here I can press my skill on Keqing, use my burst, then reactivate my skill, and then almost immediately after I'll have another charge of my skill. This is because of the 4-piece Thundering Fury set, decreasing the cooldown of my skill when I do spam this Quicken reaction. Because of that, I highly recommend going this 4-piece Thundering Fury set. It is good just in general for the damage you gain, but for Keqing, that cooldown reduction is also an additional bonus and just makes it the best option overall, especially if you maximize this set effect. With that said, other good sets include the 4-piece Thunder Soother for 35% damage against Electro affected opponents, the new Gilded Dream set for EM or mix and matching 2 pieces like 2 of an Elemental Mastery set or 2 of an Attack percent set, or even 2 pieces of Oblige can all be decent options, but again, you should get 4 Thundering Fury for this team comp as it's generally the best, and if you don't have it, you can roll for it in the strong box that was recently updated. Alright, now moving on, let's talk about what stats you want on Keqing to maximize your damage. First thing I want to say is that generally going for crit rate and crit damage on an Aggravate character like Keqing is going to be the main thing you want. This is because all of your damage can crit, even the Aggravate reaction, so critting is obviously going to be very important. With that said, Attack and Elemental Mastery are both very good for Keqing. Now, a lot of people have been asking me if Attack or Elemental Mastery is better and how much of each you need. Now, as much as I want to answer that, it's really difficult to answer because there is no definitive answer. In fact, Attack percent and Elemental Mastery are both important, and for Keqing herself, Elemental Mastery will typically be a bit better, assuming you are in an aggravate team where you're constantly proccing that reaction. However, attack percent isn't far behind, and if you have external buffs of elemental mastery, like for example, you run Keqing with Sucrose, who gives you elemental mastery, then attack percent can be better. On top of that, it also depends on your substats and your weapon, and so you should just go for better substats overall. This is especially relevant when you talk about which sands you want to run, as attack percent and elemental mastery can both be really good options for your Keqing. So I would recommend evaluating this based on who's buffing you and what they're giving you, and also and especially based on your substats. EM is typically only slightly better, and if you have other sources of EM, then attack can be better. Because of that, I recommend going for attack or elemental mastery on your sands, an electro damage bonus goblet, and either crit rate or crit damage on your circlet, whichever one you need more of. For your substats on every piece, crit rate, crit damage, elemental mastery, and attack percent are all going to be very good. Now moving on, let's talk about Keqing's best weapons. She is a character who has a lot of really good options, both for 4 stars and 5 stars, which means that pretty much anyone can have a good option for her. With that said, I want to start by saying that some weapons get better or worse depending on how you play Keqing. For example, how many charge attacks you're doing versus how many skills you get to use in a rotation. But with that said, here are her best overall weapons that you should try to go for. First of all, for your 5-star options, most of them are going to be really good. The Jade Cutter, the Mist Splitter, and the Haran are all really good for Keqing because they provide you with a ton of stats and a ton of crit on the effect. Jade Cutter is typically the best overall, but all of them are really good. Lastly, for the 5 stars, the Summit Shaper is fine as well, and technically the Freedom Sworn is too because you get EM and you can buff your team, but I would rather use this on someone like Kazuha, although it can be surprisingly good since EM is actually good for Keqing now. With that said, there's also some really powerful 4-star and more accessible options that we have to talk about. First of all, the Lion's Roar, especially with refinement, is really good for Keqing, as you're typically going to be fighting enemies that are affected by Electro in a Quicken/Aggravate team comp, and it just gives you a lot of attack percent as well. The Black Sword is another typical Keqing weapon, which gains value the more charge and normal attacks you're doing, but also just gives you good crit rate and pretty decent stats. Blackcliff Longsword is decent if you need crit damage, and Iron Sting is typically going to be your go-to free-to-play weapon that you can craft from the blacksmith. While Prototype Roncore is what people used to run for Keqing builds because of the high base attack, especially for physical, but just in general, with the new patch and elemental mastery actually being good on Keqing, this paired with the pretty decent effect that you can even refine for free with just prototypes is actually going to be your go-to free-to-play weapon, and as you will see in the damage calcs that I'll show very shortly, Iron Sting is actually very good. Now with that said, another weapon I do want to mention is the Harbinger of Dawn, but this one is going to be very situational. While this weapon has a low base attack, it makes up for it with a lot of crit damage and a ton of crit rate on the effect at Refinement 5. With that said, this 28% crit rate that you gain is only active when your Keqing's above 90% HP. This makes it not realistic as a main DPS option unless you're running a shield character like Zhongli. Some aggregate Keqing teams can run Zhongli on a full HP build with a very tanky shield, which will allow you to stay 100% HP all the time, or at least for an Abyss run, where you can keep this passive up. This is especially relevant for the Abyss, as I said, because if you do accidentally take damage or mess up, you can retry, and having that powerful Zhongli shield can make this weapon very viable. Without a shield though, I would recommend using Iron Sting as your free-to-play option, with the other weapons that I mentioned being amazing as well. With that said, here's the exact weapon ranking, but do keep in mind a few things. As I said, this does highly depend on your team comp, rotation, and your stats, like how much EM versus attack you have, so do use this as a general ranking that can vary from player to player. With that said, as you can see, the 5-star weapons are all very good, and so are many 4-star options like the free-to-play Iron Sting, the Lion's Roar, especially with Refinement, Black Sword, and also Harbinger if you are shielded. Now moving on for Keqing's Constellations, while you don't need these, I want to quickly talk about them because she is a standard 5-star character, so by playing the game and by losing 50/50s, there's a chance you've unlocked some of them. First of all, your first Constellation isn't the biggest deal, it just gives you an extra instance of electro damage when you recast your elemental skill, scaling with your Keqing's attack. The damage isn't amazing, but it is a slight bonus. Your second Constellation is one with a lot of potential that gives your Keqing 50% chance of producing an elemental particle whenever you are normal or charge attacking and you hit opponents affected by electro. This gives you an extra source of energy generation, which can help battery other characters you might have on your team, like Beidou. Now the problem with this Constellation is that while it does have a lot of potential, I've heard people test it say that it's bugged and that it can proc inconsistently. While I obviously don't have C2 at least activated, so I haven't personally tested it, according to Keqing mains and some of my friends that have tested it, it does proc a bit inconsistently, but I will put more information on that if you're curious in the description down below. Although just in general, this Constellation giving you elemental particles can be nice, but is more or less relevant depending on your team and their energy needs. Your C3 and 5 both give you more talent levels, which is honestly pretty good for Keqing, and your fourth Constellation is actually very good. After you proc an electro reaction, which is something you're going to be constantly doing, you gain 25% attack, which is honestly quite a lot. Like, that's a good amount of stats that you're gaining, so this is definitely a very good Constellation. And lastly, your sixth Constellation is also a very good one, giving you 6% electro damage bonus every time you normal attack, charge attack, or use your skill or your burst. Now, while for a C6 this is kind of underwhelming compared to like some of the limited characters C6s, it is still a decent damage increase that is pretty nice for Keqing, but definitely not something you should be actively trying to get. Alright, now moving on, let's finally talk about how how to build an Aggravate Keqing team. Now, while my last Keqing guide covered every different playstyle for Keqing, since Aggravate is just so much better and the meta right now, I'm going to be focusing this section on Aggravate Keqing, but I'll also just talk about some general supports that you want to be running with her. So an Aggravate Keqing team is typically composed of two main supports: another Electro character, who is usually going to be Fischl, and a Dendro character, with the best one being the Dendro MC. The reason for this is because Fischl, I've made many videos on why she's broken. Basically just amazing Ascension 4 passive, good damage and energy and all that, who you want to be pairing with Keqing for two very powerful sources of electro damage. This can be a different option though. You can get away with Yai, Miko, or other offensive electro supports, but Fischl is going to be your go-to and the best one overall. For your Dendro option, right now we don't have too many. Tsirnari is more of an on-field carry or burst DPS, whatever you want to call him, and Kole is unfortunately just not as good as DMC because of the internal cooldown on her burst and less Dendro application, so I do recommend running the main character as your Dendro option. On top of that, everyone has the Traveler and they are very easy to build. And the way this works, you're going to apply enough Dendro for you to then apply a ton of Electro through Fischl and Keqing, spam the Aggravate reaction, and buff your damage. This is therefore going to be the core part of your team. Now, the last slot is going to be more flexible. First of all, for the standard option, you're going to pick something that is either an offensive or a defensive support that will give you the most amount of utility. So for an offensive option, you can run an Anemo character that will buff your damage. Thinking, for example, of someone like Kazuha, who can run just a ton of buffs through like his passives, giving you more elemental damage bonus, having good damage himself, but also being able to run the Viridescent Venerer set, decreasing the resistance of opponents, and then even something like the Freedom Sworn if you do have that. Similar things can be said about Sucrose, who will give you a ton of elemental mastery, the Viridescent Venerer set as well, and even access to the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers for an attack buff to your carry. For more defensive options, you can still run that Viridescent Venerer set that I talked about on an Anemo healer like Jean or Sayu, but especially Jean because Jean's actually just a strong character who has good damage, gives you healing, and can reliably proc the Viridescent Venerer. For an Anemo healer though, or Anemo character in general, do be sure to swap into them and maintain that Viridescent Venerer uptime so that your Electro characters are buffed at all times. Another good option is actually going to be Zhongli, who is someone who is honestly really good this patch because you can get a really tanky shield that will effectively make you immune to taking damage as long as you build HP on your Zhongli, decrease the resistance of opponents through your shield, buff your damage, and also have access to the Petra set or other offensive sets like Tenacity of the Millith. But I really like Petra in this team because you just have so many sources of electro damage through Fischl, Keqing, and Aggravate that the Petra set is obviously going to be a very strong one. And so those are typically these sort of standard options. Now, with that said, there are many other flex options. For example, for healers other than an Anemo one, you can run someone like Bennett if you just want an attack buff because Bennett's Bennett, but obviously you wouldn't be trying to proc burning with Bennett, you'd just be using him for his buff. Lastly, for a Hydra option as your last slot, this can work, but you do need to keep in mind how the Dendro reactions are going to work. Since the way Aggravate works is by applying Electro to a Quicken aura, you want to make sure you can maintain the Quicken aura on enemies. When you apply too much Hydro to it, when you apply Hydro twice, you can consume that Quicken aura, basically making it to where you aren't proccing Aggravate as consistently. Because of that, fast Hydro appliers like Xingqiu or Yelan, while they are very powerful off-field supports, are typically not going to be recommended for an Aggravate team. For a Hydro healer though, since they do apply Hydro pretty slowly, especially Barbara, can actually be a decent option since you can still proc Aggravate and get some extra Hyper Blooms without really messing your uptime. Kokomi can apply Hydro a bit too fast, so Aggravate might not have 100% uptime, but she can still make up for it. Because of that, they are viable, but in general, I do personally recommend either a more offensive option like Kazu or Sucrose, or a defensive one like Zhongli or Jean or an Anemo healer in general that are typically going to give you more damage overall and allow you to consistently proc Aggravate. With that said, I'm now going to include a quick showcase of my Aggravate Keqing team, just clearing the floor 12 of the current Spiral Abyss. Now, do keep in mind, my Keqing is pretty well geared on a Jade Cutter with 4 Thundering Fury and, pretty good stats on the artifacts. With that said, my ratio is very good, 88-16 with some Elemental Mastery and Attack, level 90 Keqing, level 8 Talents, and also Constellation 1. Usually I keep my showcases C0, but I activated her C1 like over a year ago, probably close to 2 years ago now, and obviously I can't turn it off, but it isn't that big of a deal. With that said, I really hope you enjoyed the guide, and I hope you'll enjoy the showcase. Let's go.
Happy to apply. My royal scatter.
One with nature. Clouds high. The bird.
Don't blink. Cut to the chase. Incoming.
Into the wind. As one with wind and cloud.
Springboard. Speed of light. Nowhere to hide. Hey. My royal
Clouds high. Birds call. Wind strong.
cut to the chase. Yeah. Don't blink.
As you wish. Into the wind. choose. As one with wind and cloud.
Spring forth! Cut to the chase. Speed of light. Hey! Shadow Raven. Incoming. Yeah!
And so yeah, that's about it. As you can see, Aggravate Keqing is a really good character now, genuinely, and is also a lot of fun to play. I really want to thank you guys for all the support on my last few videos, especially like my stream highlight ones and my guide videos that are a ton of fun to make. As always, if there's anything you want to add regarding this guide, it will be in a pinned comment down below, so be sure to check for that. And as always, I hope the guide was helpful, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.